In the King's Indian defense, white has a natural space advantage at the start of the game in most lines. He pushes his pawns in the center and quickly takes over the center. Often black's play hinges on being able to show that white's position has become overextended and can be felled by some sort of tactical blows. So to illustrate this, we'll see my game with the black pieces against a master named Barrett from the New York Championship of 2017 in Albany. This is, of course, still opening theory. We're only on move 6, and white has played the 4-pawn attack, one of the oldest tries against the King's Indian, the line that's the old classical masters like Tarrasch would refute the King's Indian, but now, of course, we know that not to be the case. But it's still a viable option. So here I hit back with c5. One of the main moves, you could say the main move here, striking at the center. And my opponent took on c5, which is not the most common move. Most common is d5, which then black usually replies with e6, and the game goes into a kind of Benoni position with white's f-pawn advanced on f4, and well, it's a whole other story. But my opponent took on c5, which is not the main move, but it is not completely harmless either. So normally black here plays queen a5. Of course, you don't want to take on c5. Of course, you don't want to take on c5 because then white could trade queens and then play e5, which blocks out the bishop from g7 and allows the knight to come into d5, for instance. So this is a bad position for black. Instead, the normal move is queen a5, and then white plays bishop d3, because if he continues capturing, then knight takes e4 is bad for white. The c3 pawn, black will again has big threats against c3, and the white king is still in the center. Normally bishop d3, then queen takes c5, queen e2, and white prepares bishop e3 to get castled. The black queen has to move yet again. Nevertheless, black's position is fine. It's considered to be about equal, but white has some ideas to play here, and there are some specialists that like this as white. Instead, I played a kind of rare move, which might eventually start to be considered best, which I think is a very strong move, knight a6. This is a pawn sacrifice, and it looks a little paradoxical at first, but when we realize that white has spent the first 4 moves of the game pushing pawns, and then yet another move making a capture, which will allow black just to gain more time, then it starts to make sense. White will take another pawn, and black will have a weak d-pawn, but white's position will be very exposed and his king will be in the center. And we're going to see the results of that. The first point, though, of course, is black wants to take with the knight on c5 rather than the queen, which is a big advantage. He doesn't spend as much time, the knight isn't exposed and won't have to move again, and black will be threatening the e4 pawn. So that makes a major difference, and basically white has to take on d6. Otherwise, black will have a very good game. Now I take back with my pawn simply. So black is down a pawn and has an isolated, sickly-looking d-pawn. However, the real weakness in the position is white's pawn on e4, and the fact that the white king is not castled and will have trouble castling. Naturally, this depends on some very specific variations. So now white played bishop d3. He has to get ready to castle and protect his pawn. I played queen b6. This is an important part of black's play. The queen stops white from castling, and so black takes time out to do that and forces white to go into some contortions to try to castle. Now queen e2, white played. Simple enough. His plan is bishop e3, gaining a tempo, attacking my queen, and getting ready to castle. And now I played knight c5. This variation depends on this tactical point, that now if white plays bishop e3, he loses after queen takes b2, which then if after queen takes, of course, otherwise the rook and knight are both under attack, and some other things, black threatens some other things as well. But if queen takes b2, then knight takes d3, forks the king and queen, so black regains the queen and wins a piece. So white played rook to b1 in my game. He's preparing bishop e3. It's hard otherwise to give advice what white should do. But if he achieves bishop e3 and castles without me managing to do something, then he will have a great game with an extra pawn and slowly consolidate, and then go over to the attack. So I need to be energetic here, as is often the case for black in the King's Indian. I played rook e8. My rook lines up on the e file, aimed at his king and queen, and aiming at the weak pawn on e4. I have a specific plan in response to bishop e3 prepared. So white now played bishop e3, which is, of course, this is his plan. He needs to get castled. Now that was a crucial moment, because if he castles, then he's going to be threatening b4. This knight won't be able to take on d3 with check, for instance. He'll also be getting ready to just play bishop f2 and solidly guard his e-pawn, and my position might run out of threats. If he can get castled, then it will be much harder for black to make any kind of impression. So I needed to have something ready here, and that's why I played bishop f5, adding the pressure to his e-pawn. And this depends on a lot of variations that are very intricate. So he castled now. The white king has to escape from the center. If instead e takes f5, then the point is knight takes d3. And if queen takes d3, then rook takes e3, and black wins the queen. And if king to d2, then knight to c5. And then, for instance, this position, black is down a pawn still, but he has more than enough compensation. First of all, most important, the white king is completely exposed and will be for the foreseeable future. There's no safe haven for the white king that he can realistically reach. Second of all, white's in a very awkward pin on the e file. It's not going to be easy to move his queen out of that pin because then the bishop on e3 will be inadequately guarded. Black has ideas like knight e4, knight g4, also queen b4 is another annoying move that white will face real soon. There can be threats against the c-pawn, which will be hanging out too much. So black has more than enough compensation there. So white castled, and now it looks on the surface dangerous to take the e-pawn, but in fact black is able to do it. It looks like it doesn't work tactically because of white's counter threat of b4, but we'll see that with careful calculation it was seen that black can take on e4. Of course, white is in his own pin, and as we'll see, his position is very exposed tactically and positionally. So I played knight f takes e4. Now he took with his knight on e4. If he wants to play b4, he has to first make this exchange, because then otherwise the knight on c3 is hanging. If bishop takes e4, then bishop takes e4, and now the rook on b1 is hanging as well, and the knight on c3 is still there. If white now takes on e4, then rook takes e4 reaches the same position in the game, just with a different order of moves. Meanwhile, if white moves his rook away, then black can claim a pleasant advantage here, I would say. He's got his pawn back, and white is in some trouble on the e-file. His queenside is a little weak. This bishop is a very strong piece. When you compare to white's bishop, which is blocked by his f-pawn and is in an awkward position, it's better. Black also has the two bishops. He can move his knight away, but even if white manages to take, then the knight on c3 is gone also, which leaves the queenside weak. So this is somewhat better for black. White instead took with the knight, then bishop takes. Now he had to take on e4 because his own bishop's under attack. Rook takes, and white now decided to force matters with b4, which of course was this was the main variation when calculating all of these things, with bishop f5 to start off with. Otherwise, black has just got his pawn back, and for instance, rook to e8 is coming. The black pieces are very active. White has no realistic threats against the black d-pawn, which is formally a weakness, but really it's not really that weak. And also black has moves like queen b4 coming, for instance. just very much more active position for black. And the fact that white's pawn is on f4 is a major problem for white. This really shows how overextended his position is. If this pawn were back on f2, I guess you could say white's position was perfectly all right. But with the pawn on f4, he's facing a lot of troubles. So he played b4, and now my knight is under attack. Has to move somewhere. He's for instance, if I try to play rook a to e8, he can just take, and he attacks my queen. So then if rook takes e3, white has queen takes e3, and white stays up a rook. So the question was whether to move the knight to a4 or to e6. And in fact, both moves are pretty good for black. But there were some differences. In general, if we go into the endgame, as happened in the game, I would rather my knight be on e6. So if knight e6, bishop takes b6, rook takes e2, and now this knight covers the important d square, also covers c7, and it attacks f4. So white's bishop is hanging, and the only move is bishop f2, and then black can, for instance, take on f4, or can play rook c8 first, attacking the c-pawn. But black has or just take the a-pawn, in fact, as it may be. So takes a2 might be but leaving white also with some more weaknesses, and now black would have an extra pawn. However, the reason I chose knight a4 instead is that if knight e6, I had to deal with move rook f to e1 when it wasn't completely clear. There were some unclear lines here, some unclear variations. This avoided the endgame. So ultimately I decided knight a4 was better, despite the fact that he would have bishop d4 or bishop c7. So this move actually forces him to take the queen, because now also knight c3 is a threat. So he takes on b6, rook takes e2, and now the bishop needs to move away. Black is threatening to take the bishop. So his was a choice between the move he played in the game, bishop c7, which was natural, and this was the main line. This attacked the d-pawn, which is my own main weakness. Or also he could play bishop d4 or bishop f2. So bishop d4 was what I was most concerned with. And here I can take the pawn on a2, but I think I was first planning to play rook to c8, attacking the c-pawn. And black will win a pawn. I will take a pawn on a2, and should win. It would take some technique, but black should win. Bishop f2 was much worse. I would rather keep the bishops on the board from black's point of view. So I would just take on a2, and black next will have rook c8 as well, attacking this pawn, or rook c2, and knight c3 is also coming. So this is a big advantage for black. And then finally bishop c7, the move he played. So that's what he played. Now I played knight c3, rook b to e1, and here a key move at the end, which looks a little bit surprising, because you might imagine that I'm about to take a pawn, or take something at least, and or maybe play rook c8 and try to take his c-pawn. But instead I just played this little move bishop f8, but this was by far the strongest, and this move was decisive. The reason is because white's bishop is now trapped, and this forces white to give up all of his pawns practically. This is much better than, for instance, if I took on a2, bishop takes d6, and here white keeps equal material, and he has a fair amount of activity. So black doesn't really have any advantage here. Same thing if I trade rooks first, also bishop takes d6, and we've traded off weaknesses, and black's no longer has anything real effective here. And finally, if rook c8, then bishop takes d6, rook c4, a3, and white's worse, but he's still holding on. He's kept equal material, and while my pieces are active, and maybe I can try to attack his a-pawn, in doing so I will often have to allow him some more activity by trading rooks, and his rook can come into the game and start counterattacking. So it wasn't very clear. Much better was bishop f8, which is what I played. Now I'm threatening rook c8, and then if bishop a5, then I'll have b6. So this basically forced him to do something. So he took on e2. Knight takes e2, king f2, and now the best move, knight c3. Of course, I don't want to trade my knight for his bishop by rook c8. I want to leave his bishop there and keep my knight jumping around. But the tempting move, knight f4, is not as good because he has c5, and white's fighting on here. My d-pawn is pinned, so the position becomes simplified, and white has chances. So instead, knight c3. So again, rook c8 is threatened, and it turned out that the only good reply is rook c8. Is c5 rather. The only reply to rook c8. So he played c5. That's the only way to get the bishop out. So I took b takes c5, and now bishop takes c5, king g3, knight takes a2. This was the conclusion of it. Black is up 2 pawns and easily winning, and so the game finished shortly afterwards.